Good morning. This is Mike Krenke, the coordinator for the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. I'm in Rochester, Minnesota today for a best management practice guideline field day tour that we're looking at a site for August. So we're doing this long distance. Our speaker today, Dr. Hans Schabel, is out of Stevens Point, Wisconsin from his home. He's a retired professor from the University of Stevens Point in forestry, has a vast experience in forestry education, has led field trips to the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest of Germany, to the Schach Hornberg, if I pronounce that correctly, Hans, which is in the Black Forest, and also leads field trips to Kilimanjaro and other places. Just wrote a book on insects of Africa, which is really a monster encyclopedia of insects of Africa, which was a long undertaking, which Hans may also talk about. He has his own private forest land in Custer, near Custer, Wisconsin, central Wisconsin, which he has been managing for sustainable forestry principles. The German forestry, sustainable forestry principle is considered, I believe, the founding of sustainable forestry. So not only that European background and experience of all those years of managing under intense population pressures, but then with Hans's experience coming from that area and living there and bringing those concepts here to the United States. So it's exceptional to have Hans today presenting sustainable forestry, and I appreciate him being here. Before I turn it over to Hans, a few little bookkeeping. We have we have people from around Minnesota online today from DNR, Aiken County, St. John's Arboretum, Grand Portage Tribal Council, around River Renewables. We have Potlatch, or Fond du Lac Tribe. We have a really good variety of foresters and land managers from around Minnesota. It's nice to have you all online. So the procedure, if you haven't been online before, is on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see a chat pod. And so this little chat pod is where you can type in your questions for Hans as he's going along, and he will answer them when he can fit them into his presentation. So feel free to type in any questions you may have now or as we go along, and then that little arrow to the right of the chat pod, that kind of down arrow goes to the left. Click on that and it will go to everyone. If it says everyone down below, click on everyone, and then everyone will be able to see your question, and then Hans will be able to answer it. If you want continuing forest education credit, just indicate to me, and I will make sure that Lisa Brewer in our office will track the 1 credit for you for continuing forest education stewardship plan writers. So with that in mind, those are all the announcements I have right now. I'm going to turn it over to Hans, Professor Hans Schabel. He's recently retired from the university, so he's a professor emeritus in forestry. And then we'll be going with his presentation for perhaps a half an hour or so, and then questions and answers, and then we'll be done before 10. So thanks again for being here, and looking forward to Hans's program. Hans, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful morning here in the Lake States. I understand in Minnesota just as well as here in Wisconsin. And I just come back from walking in my woods. Very excited because I heard a black-billed cuckoo, and an almost tropical sound. I'd never heard one and never seen one before, even after living here for decades. Supposedly very secretive bird, but also very interesting thing to have. But nevertheless, in the process, I almost forgot to come in here to do this webinar.
Mm-hmm.
But the next best thing to being in the forest is to talk about it. Among the participants of this webinar, I noticed there's a Steve Olson. There must be at least 2 Steve Olsons in the world, because the other one was a student of mine who is now married to an Ethiopian woman and is an ecotourist outfitter in that particular country, and I'll see him later this year. Very exciting. But nevertheless, let's not get distracted. I will be talking about the Dauerwald and near natural forestry. And if you haven't heard the term yet, Dauerwald, it is a German word that means permanent forest or perpetual forest or continuous forest, as defined by a fellow by the name of Möller. He defined it in his book that he wrote in the 1920s. But he defined Dauerwald as an uneven-aged forest that is vertically structured, that is ecologically sound, that is composed of mixed trees, largely self-regulatory, let nature work harder, that's what how he put it, that has high volume and high quality wood. Okay, that's a pretty tall order, as you'll admit, but we do have another definition that evolved quite a number of decades later and was put together by a Swiss silviculturist by the name of Trepp. He defined the Dauerwald as he defined Dauerwald as an uneven-age silviculture wherever the system can be accomplished economically with indigenous species. So you can already see that the concept tries to balance economics with ecology. Now, Dauerwald is not identical with what is now called near natural forestry. I abbreviated it NNF, and I give you a definition that is a little modified from one that was presented by the United Nations in 2001. It is a philosophical and practical approach. Near natural forestry is a philosophical and practical approach to holistic forest management, emphasizing natural processes to sustainably assure economic, ecological, and social benefits from site-specific forests. Okay, so that one is a definition that very widely applies in many parts of the world where near natural forestry is coming on very strong at this particular point. So if you grow eucalypts in California, let's say, even if you grow them very successfully there, that would not be near natural forestry, okay? The site-specific forests are quite important in understanding this concept. Now, there's a lot to be learned from other countries, and especially in forestry that is Europe, because that's where scientific forestry evolved. And as a result, I'll take you through 4 periods of forest history in Europe: the primeval and medieval forest. Then we'll look at the evolution of the Dauerwald ideas in the 1800s. Then we'll look at what happened to those ideas in the early 1900s. And lastly, we're going to look at the fate of near natural forestry as it evolved in the post-World War II period. Okay. Primeval and medieval forests. They were about, in Europe, they were about 2/3 hardwood and 1/3 conifers. Obviously, these trees were found wherever they did best. There was abundant wildlife at that particular point. The picture that you see is one of the European buffalo. And the tree that you see here in the picture is a white oak, one of the 2 species of white oak in Europe. In that time, then also there was more or less an opportunistic exploitation of these resources. In other words, whoever had access to the land was using it for their own purposes, and that was not necessarily regulated. So people were just exploiting, taking whatever was available. Much of what they were looking for was, of course, products from the forests, wood products, and the oak at the same time and beech trees were important for food indirectly, because the mast was feeding swine that the local people would be driving into the woods during the time when that particular food was available. So that early forest, that primeval and medieval forest, was all about products, either woody products or food products. And you see here that one picture with the forest mushrooms, the hen of the woods. I wish I had more trees like that. It's a wonderful edible mushroom. Nevertheless, eventually forests moved during the period of mercantilism, to a commercial approach, when landowners started trying to maximize profit from the forest. So essentially we moved from subsistence to sport and to commerce when it came to wildlife and also to other dimensions of the forest. There was an increasing demand, of course, with an increasing population, and the first people that called themselves foresters were essentially game managers. They were managing game in the medieval times for nobility, and they called themselves foresters, derived from the Latin word forest. Forest means outside. So foresters were people who worked outside, and the first foresters were game managers. They were not very concerned with trees. After centuries of exploitation, and especially then after commercial exploitation, there were crises developing. A lot of forest land was converted to agricultural land and other uses, and of course the forests that remained were frequently of low quality because they were overcut, high-graded all the time. They were overgrazed, pastured, and they were over-raked. By that I mean that especially rural populations were going into the woods and collecting the litter for the stables. And if you do that for decades, and if you do that for centuries, then of course you can expect some implications for soil fertility. So it's very important to keep that point in mind. With forests being lost, with land degrading and forest degrading, there were finally some local ordinances. People had to respond to the shortages, and one of them was, for instance, that you could only pasture so and so many animals at a particular point in a particular forest. So those were the first ordinances concerning forestry, forest use. And another one you see in this particular picture of half-timbered construction. Those who've traveled to Europe have seen these very pleasant looking buildings, but they were not designed primarily for aesthetic purposes, but they resulted from local ordinances when there were wood shortages, when the ordinance stated that no fully timbered houses could be built. So these were partially half-timbered structures. And by the way, for those of you who know Hermann Hesse, the German writer, Steppenwolf and Siddhartha, he was a cult figure during the hippie age. He was born right here. I'll show it with an arrow in a black forest, a small black forest town. Okay. So there were shortages of wood and other forest products, and that led to the first foresters, tree foresters, that is, and to the development of scientific forestry. That was over 200 years ago, and at that particular point, a mining engineer was the one who designed this concept of sustainable yield. Sorry, I got a sore throat. This fellow was in charge of supplying his mines with wood for various uses. And since timber was getting scarce, he had to go farther and farther to get the wood, which was, of course, making it more and more expensive. And he anticipated the day when the mine that he was working for would not be able to operate economically. So one day he had this brilliant idea that you could probably design forests if you knew how much trees were growing every year, and then you could calculate how much acreage you had to have in order to provide sustainable yield that would supply his particular mine. So it was a mining engineer responsible for that scheme, sustainable yield. Scientific forestry relied to a great extent on age class-based wood factories. That was the challenge of the day. They had to address the timber shortage. Okay, they had come up with something that would provide sufficient wood to meet the needs. But that kind of forestry was very mechanistic, almost militaristic, as you can see here, a spruce forest. It was like constructed mathematically, and that was easy to do because in those days, the military in Germany was very, very rigid and very strict. The system of scientific forestry relied very much on artificial regeneration. In other words, they had nurseries, they were growing trees, they were collecting seed wherever it was available, easily available, and they ignored in the process that, there were genetics involved. In other words, tree seed from the mountains and tree seed from the lowlands ended up mixed, and eventually you had trees from the mountain grow in the lowlands and vice versa. And of course, that had some implications, as you can imagine. Artificial regeneration, by the way, having this nursery business was also very expensive because very labor intensive. The system relied on conifer monocultures. They were easy to do, and like I say, you could quantify the whole scheme in concept with a sustainable yield. And for that reason, that came in. And it all eventually led to a reversal of that ratio of 2/3 hardwood to 1/3 conifers. Eventually, there were 2/3 conifers and 1/3 hardwoods in Central Europe. The system relied on economic rotation, and in other words, the trees would be cut whenever it was most economic. The system relied very heavily on clear cutting, Scotch pine in particular, but also in Norway spruce. And mechanization increasingly came in. And the system was so successful in meeting these timber shortages that the system was essentially adopted elsewhere throughout the world, including North America. So scientific forestry was very successful, initially at least, but problems soon arose. Among them, wind, snow, especially affected the spruce, which was shallow-rooted and frequently fell over in storms. And in Scotch pine, fires were very damaging. So it was a very expensive kind of forestry, because you had to deal with all these problems. Insects, defoliators, bark beetles, foamizanosis, and then also deer. Deer were a passion of the nobility there. They had the privilege of hunting, and they, of course, wanted to provide the largest number of deer for the greatest sport. But at the same time, deer are browsers, and for that particular reason, there were problems developing. Other problems that developed, site index decline. I pointed out before that frequently the woods had been raked for litter. and in the process you remove nutrients, and of course if you keep doing this over time, then the site index declines. And that was becoming obvious. Other problems, there were no what's called legacies, deadwood, no standing trees, no down trees that were dead, and biological diversity was very, very poor. Lots of plants, lots of animals did not thrive in that kind of forest, except for this bird that you see here, which is the world's largest grouse, the capercaillie grouse, and that one was actually thriving. That one was actually thriving in these conifer monocultures because blueberries were growing underneath these trees under the acid conditions provided by the needles of the trees. And then, of course, these forests were very uniform, and for that reason, some people took offense. Okay, with all these problems evolving, some people had ideas, such as early as in 1824, there was a book written by van der Borg and another one a couple of decades later, where they were complaining about the forest not looking good. In 1858, you had a fellow writing about the importance of soil, and he may have been the first one to fully appreciate, the significance of soil. The mother of the forest is the soil. In 1884, there was a fellow by the name of Van College near Berlin. He lived in this particular estate house that you see in the picture, and he was in part dependent on the income from the forest. Now, he had found out that the site index was going down and down and down. The productivity of the land was suffering. And he had some ideas of how he would improve that, and he started experimenting and eventually improved that forest. So his main concern was economics. Van der Borg and Koenig were concerned about aesthetics. Wenner was concerned about soil. Van College was concerned about economics. And then in 1886, there was a fellow by the name of Geyer, and he wrote a very influential book in which he made a case for hardwoods and mixed forests, looking at that type of forest from several angles. Now, each of those had different ideas, and it took this particular fellow to synthesize the ideas. Möller was a forest mycologist. That's why he got this mushroom there. And he had traveled very widely. He had traveled to the tropics. He had traveled to see natural forests in North America. And he put all these ideas and observations together in what he called the Dauerwald. Okay? He wrote about it, a book in 1922, a book called The Dauerwald, Its Purpose and Importance. In it, he made a case that production of the forest and nature protection of the forest and service functions, environmental and social functions of the forest should all be on an equal footing. And he said the most productive forest can also be the most beautiful. And that he emphasized all along in developing that idea. The principles as spelled out by Möller included the balance of nature. As you know, modern ecologists don't like that term because forests are dynamic, they're changing all the time, and you can get the balance, of course, disrupted by natural processes. But nevertheless, at that time, he felt like the forester should strive for a balance of nature. He was making an argument for biodiversity, by pointing out that each rare species of tree and shrub and other plant should be treated like a natural treasure. That's what he called it, a natural treasure. He also picked up on the idea that soil is very important. Being a mycologist, he fully appreciated the role of microbes and of fungi for soil fertility. Allow me for a second to drink something to clear up my throat.
Almost got the skirt. And the diaper's seated wrong again. Somebody likes that fidget all the time.
Well, I'm back. I hope that helps. Okay. One of the principles of the Dauerwald, according to Möller, was that you should strive for mixed composition with site-adapted species. Very important today, this is called authenticity. You work with those trees that are best adapted to a particular forest, to a particular site. He said uneven age structure is desirable in the same way that we nowadays, promote horticulture, along the concept of polyculture. The more uneven age the forest is, the more well-structured it is, the more productive it tends to be, and the more intact in ecological terms. Then he argued that we should abstain from large-scale clear-cuts. And you can imagine that was something that not many of his colleagues liked to hear, because the entire forestry of the day was based on clear cuts. And there's numerous advantages to clear cutting, technical advantages, economic advantages, and so forth. So that put him on collision course with quite a number of his colleagues that ended up with some bitter exchanges of accusations. But his argument was that if you want an apple, what do? You don't cut down the apple tree, do you? If you want apples permanently every year, you keep that apple. And he said, wood to the forest is like the apple is to the apple tree. The Dauerwald would have no rotation. In other words, when it was time to cut a tree by several criteria, that's when it would be cut. And then he said we should strive to build large and valuable inventory. In other words, both quality and quantity. Okay, like I said before, Möller unleashed a storm of criticism from some of his colleagues especially when he advocated an abstention from clear cutting. And it resulted in what I call a silviculture war in the 1920s. At that time, a lot of papers were written for and against the Dauerwald. The critique was mostly that the Dauerwald is too unruly. It's difficult to quantify and regulate. Extraction of wood would be complicated. To make a Dauerwald happen, you would have to convert from the traditional forest, and that would take time. In other words, there would be some sacrifices in wood and deer to make that concept happen. And essentially, it would be a generational effort to restore a forest from the traditional, wood factory to a mixed forest, that was adhering to the principles of the Dauerwald. So there was a very difficult period for forestry because it reminds me of what happened here in the 1980s. At that time, there was a lot of mutual accusations among foresters, among what Aldo Leopold later called Type A and Type B foresters, traditionalists and reformers. But anyways, in the 1930s, there was some research results coming in from this estate that I mentioned before, where a landowner had been very unhappy with the fertility of the land, with the productivity of the land, and had started to improve by bringing in trees and doing mixes and stopping this littering process. And those and that particular research indicated that the site index in a matter of 50 years had doubled as a result of his measures. So that was very supportive of the Dauerwald idea. And it contributed to Germany introducing the Dauerwald as a mandate on all forests in 1933. A couple of years later, Aldo Leopold, who was a wildlife professor in Wisconsin at the time, and 5 other Forest Service employees, foresters from the U.S., they had a fellowship to study in Germany for a couple of months. And Aldo Leopold wrote a number of papers about that particular study tour. Many of them are classical papers, as you might expect, given his elegant writing. Now, what it all boiled down to was Leopold was impressed with a couple of things, but he was very unimpressed with other things that were happening in German forests. Especially, he complained about this, what he called conifer mania and deer mania. There were too many conifers and there were too many deer. And he argued that the way they managed both of those resources was essentially damaging to the other resource. In other words, the deer management was very destructive for forestry because of the browsing damage, and the conifer silviculture was not very good for game because the habitat was not very good. And the only way you could maintain large deer herds was by artificial feeding and other supplemental and fencing of forests and protecting trees and all that kind of thing. So he wrote a couple of papers that are very illuminating in the Journal of Forestry in the 1930s. You look at this particular picture here. I'll show it with an arrow. It is a stump of a tree that has a birch tree and a pine tree growing next to each other. So in a way it's symbolic, it indicates that battle between hardwoods and conifers that Leopold got involved with. At one time, Leopold, who was a forester initially and later became a wildlife professor, initially he was very much a conifer forester, but this trip to Europe essentially converted him to a mixed forest and hardwood protagonist. Okay. A couple of years later, the Dauerwald was terminated in Germany, so it had only been in place for about 5 years or 4 years. And what was responsible for it getting terminated? Goering, who was Hitler's imperial hunting master, he didn't like the concept at all. He wanted to see a lot of deer, and to make the Dauerwald happen, he just had to, depress the deer herd for a while at least. But at the same time, Germany was preparing for war and needed a lot of wood in the process, so it couldn't really implement a conversion, a restoration of forest from traditional forestry to this sophisticated Dauerwald concept. But anyways, the idea that Leopold was most involved with was that deer and conifer monocultures were mutually detrimental. What happened after the Second War? A concept called near-natural forestry came up. And essentially that was Dauerwald ideas, but because the Dauerwald had been associated with the Nazis, the foresters after the war didn't want to use that term, because it might, indicate a sympathy for the Nazis. So the concept was called near natural forestry from here on, but was also expanded, as we'll see later. I need to drink again, just a second. Okay. In 1950, the Yugoslav state of Slovenia mandated essentially Dauerwald. And one of the arguments, interestingly, was that, if you were fighting a guerrilla war, the Dauerwald would be a much better forest to have. And as you know, Yugoslavia was very much into guerrilla wars, and they anticipated the breakup of Yugoslavia that would again result in war. But that's just a fringe aspect. They developed a very excellent Dauerwald in Slovenia, which is an independent country now. In 1949, there was an association for natural forestry forming in Germany. These were private landowners, large private landowners, and they could not afford traditional forestry anymore. It was getting too expensive. Having nurseries, planting trees, weeding trees, and all that kind of thing was too labor intensive, too expensive. And they made an argument for what they called, let nature work harder. In order, instead of artificial regeneration, you can have natural regeneration. Nature dishes up the trees. Why would you want to introduce some from the outside, unless they were lost and you have a good reason, to bring them back. So the important thing about this association is that they had economic reasons for endorsing the concept of near natural forestry. And again, we had a period of problems evolving in the 1980s in particular. You got economic problems, ecological problems, and social problems. One problem was an ecological disaster. The forests were dying as a result of air pollution, especially as a result of car-related air pollution in West Germany and of sulfur dioxide pollution in East Germany. Forests looked like you see in that particle picture. These were the conifers that were most susceptible, and they were dying by the hundreds of acres. That particular event promoted the green movement to a great extent, because obviously people like seeing the forest and hiking there and so forth were very concerned with what was happening to the forest. So air pollution damage was a big contributor to the evolution of near natural forestry. Another thing that happened in the 80s, you had some century storms. They're probably related to this global warming. But in the process of these storms, there were enormous acreages of spruce flattened by the winds. Spruce has a very shallow root system, and especially where the spruce were being grown on sites where they didn't belong, they just fell over. The taller the spruce, of course, the bigger the leverage and the more powerful the winds were in flattening those trees. They had to bring in the military to clean up. The timber market completely crashed, as you can imagine. And of course, bark beetles were a consequence of all that downed wood. Here you see a forester with one of these bark beetles. I'll point it out with an arrow. Now, isn't that a bark beetle? They don't go. They don't grow quite that big. This is a model that he's showing, but these little beetles were extremely destructive in the wake of the air pollution damaged forests. And of course, the spruce that had been felled by the wind were equally affected by bark beetles. And then another thing, the deer populations were higher than ever before. At that particular point, the people who were were interested in hunting were just promoting deer herds that were ecologically unacceptable. You see here an attempt to bring in silver fir, and you see the white portion of this fir. This shows a repellent, a chemical repellent, without which you would not be able to grow that tree. So deer damage was enormous in those years because of the excessive deer herds. All of these were crises, and they came together into effecting change. A paradigm shift took place in the 1980s as a result of all these problems. There was just basically a movement, a green movement that had a hunger for nature and for an intact environment, for clean air and all that kind of thing. See a tree like you see here on the right side. That is an almost religious experience in Europe. For an American, that may not be the case because we're used to a lot more nature. But in Europe, there was so little wild land left, wild forest, natural nature altogether, that the public was just very restless, and they ultimately put so much pressure on the political system that a paradigm shift was inevitable. And that led in 1987 to a renewed mandate on German state forests to introduce near-natural forestry. And that was, a couple of years later, was mandated for all forests in Germany. And there were several other countries following suit. Most Central European countries are really now in the pro-silver movement, which is a movement that endorses near-natural forestry. Even England is part of that. But if you want to see excellent examples of near-natural forestry, you go to Slovenia, you go to Switzerland, you go to parts of Germany, you go to parts of France. The concept is totally entrenched now in that part of the world and even in the tropics. You look at this particular picture, and you see a conifer monoculture, spruce monoculture, that has a group of beech. Beech belongs to that site, intrinsically speaking. And they were planted. They had to be protected against deer, so an expensive process. But these became nuclei for these new mixed forests. And the ultimate vision, of course, is to have forests more in line with this here, where you have uneven-aged mixed forests. Other things that happened in that period that led to that paradigm shift was that the Biodiversity Treaty was signed internationally. The elder Bush didn't sign it, but later the Clinton government did sign it. And as a result, this was becoming a mandate, to consider biodiversity in forest management. As a result of that paradigm shift, deer populations had to be depressed, and all efforts were made in order to promote uneven-aged mixed forests that are biologically rich and aesthetic. And at the same time, you should never ignore that productive. So they did not abandon productivity. They just gave the other functions, forest functions, equal footing. Now, I told you this concept has caught on in many parts of the world, and frequently you find other terms that apply to it. So there are some synonyms, some called nature-oriented forestry, close to nature forestry, naturalistic forestry, nature-like, analog forestry, nature-friendly forestry, ecological forestry, semi-natural forestry, holistic forestry, natural process forestry, full vigor forestry, adaptive forestry. And the Dauerwald is more likely to be referred to as a continuous forest cover, a CFC forest. So that having been said, for Europe and other parts of the world, let's look at what happened here in this country. since white settlement in the 1850s. At first, there was big-time exploitation that resulted in a change in forest acreage, that resulted in a change in composition of forests, age-class distribution, and also in the spatial patterns of forests. You know, you had a lot of conversion to other land use. But nevertheless, we were very fortunate because we had a lot of nature to exploit, and we did so with enthusiasm, unbridled enthusiasm, you might say. Eventually, we had some efforts to preserve some of the land, national parks in particular. And again, we were lucky to have all that land to be able to do that. In Europe, there is no wild land left, or in very few places, and very little of it. But we had the foresight to do that, and we're now the envy of the world when it comes to national parks, at least in absolute terms. In relative terms, we're not doing so well. Other parts of the world have much more natural, have many more national parks than we do in terms of acreage, relatively speaking. Okay. Ultimately, we had the concept of conservation come in. Pinchot, made an argument for wise use of resources, and that concept was in place until the 1980s, when we had a similar crisis in the U.S. as Europe had. You had a green movement and spotted owl controversy, and you had all sorts of pressures on forests, urban spread and what have you. We had a health crisis. We had forest fire problems in many parts of the U.S. And it was at that particular point that there were calls for a change in forest policies. And as you remember, all of a sudden the chiefs of the Forest Service started being non-foresters. The change did not come from within the forest profession, but it was imposed by Congress through the funding mechanisms, and also through political assignments such as the chiefs of the Forest Service. But anyways, multiple use was mandated for federal forests in 1980, and then about 12 years later, the ecosystem management concept was introduced for federal land in the United States. Okay, let's move on to the next. We have private forest land to look at now, of which we have quite a bit in the U.S., around 60% nationally, and the same figure applies also in the lake states. In these areas, the near natural forestry is particularly attractive and also very relevant. As you know, they don't make anymore. The people pressure are increasing. People are less mobile nowadays. And as a result, near natural forestry has become a very attractive concept for those parts, especially of the eastern United States, where small-scale stand replacement patterns are typical. The western United States are a little different. You do have fire being a big factor in forestry in that part of the country. But anyways, on private forest land, we have a full range of management schemes. The one is do nothing type of forestry on many private lands. We have a lot of them under under management. And you also have exemplary land stewardship, where people take very good care of the land. It stays in the family, and they like to hand it over better or as good as they inherited it. Now, the best example for private or community forestry that I can find anywhere, and that is globally, you will find on the Menominee Indian Reservation in Wisconsin, barely an hour from where I speak right now. Now, as Mike told you, I recently retired, and as a result of that retirement, I haven't even unpacked my boxes yet of office materials. I had some magnificent pictures of Menominee Forest, but I couldn't find them for this purpose. As a result, I had to put in this truck here, and you probably wonder what the truck has to do with Menominee Indian Reservation. Well, look at the lettering there, CFI. This is what near natural forestry on the Menominee Reservation and elsewhere is all about, continuous forest inventory. That's the level of regulation that you have in near natural forestry. So let's move on and look at a private forest that was restored in a matter of about 35 years, at least not fully restored to a near natural forest, but very successfully is moving in that direction. This forest was acquired in 1976, 60 acres of degraded farm forest, had been pastured, had been burned, had been high graded and all that kind of thing. There was very little, there were very few legacies there, no deadwood. There were legacies there. There were a lot of deadwood, yes. A lot of trees were dying from Dutch elm disease, some oak wilt. There was blister rust. There was amazingly high biodiversity in the trees, but not in the shrub layer and in the herbaceous layer. So the management was started to bring this forest back to a more natural condition. There were way too many Hills oak, northern pin oak, and red maple. And the biodiversity was good, as I said. There were 35 species of trees on the land, but 2 species, the Hills oak and the red maple, were dominating the whole scene, and most of the other species were very rare or uncommon. The management objectives for that forest were fairly ambitious, but they amounted to restoring the degraded farm woodland into a well-structured, well-stocked, stable forest community with the greatest possible assortment of site-specific fauna and flora, providing timber and non-timber products in the long term without compromising ecological functions and the aesthetic appeal of the land. So it's not just about wood, but also non-wood forest products, consumptive wildlife, edible foodstuff, herbaceous flora, shiitake growing on oak logs, and so forth. I'll take you through fairly quickly some of the stuff that took place here. From 76 to 2009, there was essentially improvement tinkering just to improve the forest and get away from the overabundance of red maple and Hills oak. And ultimately that resulted in a harvest cut that was quite profitable. But the whole tinkering was about depressing undesirable species and assisting rare or beleaguered species. In other words, to manipulate the composition and the structure of that particular forest. And within 30 years, that has had quite amazing results. So depressing undesirables, such as exotic invaders. This particular invader is very common on farmland in Wisconsin, I assume in Minnesota too. This is black locust, which was brought in by early settlers, to grow naturally durable fence posts. Now, black locust has its merits, but it's also invasive, and allelopathic to other vegetation. So the best thing that could be done there was to convert it to firewood, and that was done non-chemically. So we got rid of that locust altogether. Other undesirables, exotic pathogens. You see a patch here of blister rust that grows on gooseberries. And you see an oak, a big oak, that fell to oak wilt. It's not really certain that oak wilt is an exotic species, but that's beyond, the point here. Another thing, depressing other undesirables include indigenous aggressors. Box elder was one of them, and red maple was the other one. Red maple grows very well, but at the same time, it is extremely aggressive towards oak. And if you don't want to lose the oak, then you got to depress this particular species. So box elders, red maple, and were the major species to be depressed. Another thing that had to be depressed is deer. There were way too many with the management that we had during the last 2 decades. And I do hunt with bow and with a gun, but I do it not just for sport, but also in order to keep the population at a level that is compatible with this near-natural forestry. Look at this particular picture. When you got deer showing up outside of your office, like this, then you got too many, I think. At the same time that you depress undesirables, you assist desirables, and if the topography is hilly country like we have here in the moraine, then the topography helps because you can favor species with respect to that topography. On top are the oaks and the pine. In the moist and cooler depressions, you can grow other species that are doing well in those conditions. Habitat typing is very helpful, and I understand in Minnesota you have a process that is being implemented right now. How did you call it? Ecological classification. That's a system whereby the herbaceous flora is used to decide which trees should be promoted where. This is a very useful system that evolved in Germany and then was brought by Professor Barnes, a forest ecologist in Michigan, to the Lake States, and then Wisconsin adopted it, COTA, in the COTA habitat system. And as I understand, you have it now coming in Minnesota. Ecological classification system, I think this is what it's called. Okay, assisting desirables by low grading, strict low grading. You know, high grading is always destructive in the forest, and by taking out the worst of trees, if you keep doing that over time, even your worst of trees will be fairly good trees. And then, of course, promoting legacies, having standing deadwood and having down deadwood, because deadwood is very much alive and plays significant functions in the overall productivity of the land. Assisting desirables included compositional shifts, so rare species such as these hemlock were favored, and they had to be protected against deer for a number of years, but they are coming along very nicely. Enrichment planting helped with bringing back some of these rare species, and helps with promoting that mix and that structure. Assisting desirables, rare or beleaguered species. You see an elm here that's being drilled on by a pileated woodpecker. We've had 2 waves of Dutch elm disease come through there, so it's important to maintain elm to the extent possible. And there's also a nice incentive, namely morel grow typically on elm that are dying. Then edge or fence row management is very useful. You know, by promoting flowering species and fruiting species, you promote wildlife and the overall diversity. So juneberries and high bush cranberries and arrowwood and sumac and all these species deserve to be favored along the edges if you want a near-natural forest. Assisting desirables, again by strict low grading, by maintaining proper stocking. You improve the quality, then plantation conifers are quite, you know, you can endorse those, especially for the afforestation of open land. They're the fastest way to bring open land back into a near forest condition. A plantation is not a forest, but a near forest condition. And there's no better way to get, at this particular point, to get white pine back, white pine regeneration under, you see, white pine regeneration under red pine. In other parts, it's next to impossible to get white pine natural regeneration. You can also see here there's a hardwood pocket coming in under the red pine because the thinning was fairly heavy and provided sufficient light to allow that to happen. Then natural regeneration, as I just pointed out, shelterwood system can be tried. If you can do that with a fire, then of course it's more likely to be successful when you're promoting oak. And then uneven rate structure wherever possible. You know, that obviously depends on what species mix you have, but it is making for a much more natural forest than if you don't have it. Some of the technical principles and tools in making near natural forestry happen: no or minimal chemical input. Sometimes you don't get around it, but then you can at least minimize the chemical use. Low impact technology, and I took that particular picture of logging equipment in Tennessee. Now, I wouldn't want to see that happen in a forest that is going towards near natural. It's just simply too destructive in terms of soil compaction and root damage and so forth. Then winter logging is obviously, again, much more acceptable than is summer logging. And you can also avoid unnecessary outdoor geometry in order to make cutting and other kinds of management look a little more natural and acceptable.
True.
In 2009, 2010, the first harvest cuts took place,
Yeah.
and they included clear cuts, small clear cuts of good aspen clones.
Seriously?
In a way, okay. Okay, I just see a chat here. I'm trying to check that out. But nevertheless, you cannot be too strict with this kind of concept. You know, you have to adapt it to local conditions. And if you, let's say, have a good, if you have a very good clone of aspen, then of course you want to Okay, looks like we got interrupted, but we're back now, and this is my last slide, in where I just simply want to state that the concept of quality forestry, as has been defined by the World Wildlife Fund and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they see a quality forest as being one where production, economics, ecology, and social functions come together, and where authenticity, or in other words, biodiversity of the greatest extent, is being preserved. So with Sir Francis Bacon's statement that nature to be commanded must be obeyed, I'll let you off here. Not without stating that this was the first webinar I ever gave, so I've got to get used to this concept. But you're welcome to ask questions now.
A question from Tom Kroll.
Go ahead, Tom.
What would be the level of deer populations, so many per square mile, that you think is tolerable in your Wisconsin example, for example?
Okay, we've had times when 80 per square mile were around, and the DNR in those days, they provided bonus licenses and all that. The ecologists argue more for 20 or less, okay? But remember that deer densities shift during the year. You know, during the summer they're more spread out. In the winter you get very high densities in deer yards and so forth. So it's an old battle. Aldo Leopold fought that battle in the 1940s. He was making an argument that deer density should be reduced. He was making an argument along the lines that quality deer management is making, they say, fewer but better deer. But the urban hunter wants to see a lot of deer, and they want it easy and they want it fast. And as long as that pressure is there, it is an uphill battle.
But can you refine a number though? I mean, do you think we can regenerate? You saw the picture of a shelter, but can we regenerate oak with 20 per square mile, 10 per square mile, 12 per square mile? Do you have a number?
I don't have a number except that 20 per square mile. But like I say, you can of course protect areas by fencing and so forth. But that makes it expensive again. Look at Germany. They spent 80% at one time of their protection budget for deer damage prevention. They built deer fences that would span the globe 3 times. Can you imagine that? Germany is a country the size of Oregon, and they had deer fences that added up to 3 times around the globe. They had they had reduction in benefits from forests due to deer that amounted to $200 million a year. So it is an ecological issue, and you can argue that habitat should come before game. Once the habitat is intact, then you can bring deer numbers up again. But keep in mind this deer quality management concept is a very attractive one. Deer hunters endorse that, because it promises to get better deer, fewer but better deer. Okay, Amber Jungworth, what kinds of deer protection did you use to establish the hemlock that are on your property? Okay, that's a good question. I fenced them individually. And the fence has to be at least six feet high. But once they're out of there, they take off and are in good shape unless you get some rubbing on them. So where you put them is also important. You don't want them right next to a deer trail. I put the hemlock typically in bowls, depressions, colder, moisture areas, and they're doing quite well there. As you know, the distribution of hemlock is expected to shift with global warming, so it is what I consider one of the beleaguered species. There's another one, Peter Willis. In my area, a light thinning often encourages red maple. As he noted, that is not a very desirable species. Ideas on reducing aggressive species while keeping to the principles. Okay, that's an excellent question. It is true. Light thinning often encourages red maple because it's intermediately tolerant. As a matter of fact, I see that right now with some cutting having been done. Now, red maple, you can have some good red maples, yes. You don't want them to take over. And you can look at red maple also as a serving species, especially under oak. As long as you keep the red maple under the oak, and from not pushing too far into the crown, it will help the oak clear the bowl, it will help push it straight, and it also helps with the pruning of the oak. But the minute they push into the crown, they grow so much faster, so much more aggressive. You got to knock them on the head. I typically do that when they're about firewood size. Right? It's not the best firewood, but it's a continuous source of firewood, especially for the kindling category. Okay. Peter, does that answer your question? Okay. All right. Any other questions? I probably talk too much, folks, but like I say, it takes some getting used to this format of a webinar. Okay, let me see. Yeah, I don't see any more questions. Did I overlook any? going over a lot of time. Amber, you state something about goods from the woods. That includes non-wood goods from the woods too, remember? Such as mushrooms, consumptive wildlife, and so forth. And I'm screening here if there are any more questions. Getting lots of thank yous.